The plate shattered against the kitchen wall with a crack that silenced every man in the Turner Ranch dining room. Caroline Wells stood at the head of the long oak table, her chest heaving, her dark eyes blazing with a fury she had kept buried for 3 weeks. Cornelius Turner was on his feet across from her, his hat clutched in both fists, his jaw tight as iron wire, staring at her like she had just pulled the floor out from under him. The 5 ranch hands seated between them did not breathe. "You told him," Caroline said, and her voice was quieter now, which was worse than yelling. "You told Harland Greer that I was leaving at the end of the month." Cornelius did not deny it. That was the part that broke something in her chest. "I thought it was the truth," he said. "You decided it was the truth without asking me a single word about it." She pressed her palms flat against the table and leaned forward. "You made a decision about my life, Cornelius Turner, and you handed it to the one man in this county who has been trying to run me off since the day I arrived. I was protecting you." "From what?" "From staying." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated that it did. "You have been pushing me toward the door since the day I walked through it. Every time something real passed between us, you found a reason to step back. Every time I thought this place might be home, you reminded me I was only hired help." One of the ranch hands, a young man named Pete, quietly pushed back his chair and stood. The others followed him without a word, filing out through the back door with their hats in their hands, leaving Caroline and Cornelius alone in the long dining room with the broken plate on the floor and 3 weeks of unspoken things hanging in the air between them like smoke. Cornelius set his hat down on the table. He did not look away from her. "You are not hired help," he said. "Then what am I?" He did not answer. He could not answer, and that silence told her everything and nothing all at once. And Caroline Wells turned and walked out the front door into the blinding New Mexico afternoon, and she did not look back, not because she did not want to, but because if she did, she was afraid she would stay, and staying meant wanting something from a man who did not know how to want anything back. That was the 23rd day of October, 1882. She had arrived on the first day of that same October, stepping off the Santa Fe railway spur at the Cimarron Depot with a single leather traveling trunk, a cast iron skillet wrapped in brown paper, and a letter of hire that had been arranged by a woman named Dolores Varga, who ran the domestic placement office out of Albuquerque. The letter had described Turner Ranch as a working cattle operation of some 4,000 acres in the foothills northeast of Cimarron, New Mexico territory. It had mentioned that the ranch employed 12 hands, ran approximately 800 head of Hereford cattle, and that the position of cook and household manager had been vacant for 14 months. It had not mentioned that the ranch owner was 34 years old and still carried himself like a man who was used to standing alone in large spaces. It had not mentioned the way the main house sat against the rise of the Cimarron Range, with its long covered porch facing the morning sun. It had not mentioned a single word about what it would feel like to stand in that kitchen for the first time and understand that no one had cooked a real meal in that room for well over a year. Caroline was 28 years old, born in Missouri, educated in Kansas City, widowed in Denver at 25 when her husband James Wells had gone into the mountains with a survey crew during a late spring storm and had not come back. She had spent 2 years in Denver afterward, working as a cook at the Denver Chop House, saving money, corresponding with her sister in Santa Fe, and slowly arriving at the understanding that she needed to go somewhere new. Not because Denver held too much grief, though it did, but because she was the kind of woman who needed open ground, and the city was closing in around her like a fist. The placement with Turner Ranch had seemed straightforward. A working kitchen, a house that needed managing, fair wages, room and board. Caroline had accepted it with the same practical efficiency she applied to everything. She packed her trunk, said goodbye to her friends at the Chop House, and boarded the train south. What she had not accounted for was the kitchen itself. It was a large kitchen, which was good. It had a proper cast iron range with 2 oven doors and 6 burner plates, a long preparation counter made of butcher block, open shelving along 3 walls, a dry goods pantry that opened off the east side, and a window above the sink that looked out across the near pasture toward the barn. All of that was good. What was not good was the state of it. The pantry was nearly bare. The range needed its flue cleaned. One of the burner plates had a crack in it. The shelves held a collection of empty tins, a few loose coffee beans rattling in a paper bag, a jar of molasses that had crystallized completely solid, and a single surviving onion that had begun to sprout 3 pale shoots toward the dark. Caroline stood in the middle of that kitchen for a long moment and breathed. Then she put her skillet on the counter and she began to make a list. She had not met Cornelius Turner yet. She had been met at the depot by one of the hands, an older man named Walt Briggs, who had driven her out to the ranch in a buckboard wagon without saying more than a dozen words the entire way. He had carried her trunk to the small room off the kitchen that served as the cook's quarters, told her supper was at 6, and the men would be in from the south pasture by 5:30, and then he had left her alone. Caroline had found the kitchen and begun her assessment. She had found a notebook in the drawer under the preparation counter and started writing down everything she would need. She had been doing this for perhaps 20 minutes when the back door opened and Cornelius Turner walked in. She recognized him as the owner because of the way he carried himself. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair starting to show the first threads of gray at his temples, and a beard kept close and neat. He wore working clothes, not show clothes, denim trousers and a gray flannel shirt dark with sweat at the collar, but there was something in the way he moved through the doorway, something deliberate and self-contained, that announced him clearly. He stopped when he saw her. His eyes went to the notebook, then to her trunk visible through the open bedroom door, then back to her face. "You are the cook," he said. "Caroline Wells," she said. "Yes," he nodded. He looked at the empty pantry shelves. A long quiet settled between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but heavy in the way that silences become heavy when both people are aware of what they are not saying. "The pantry needs restocking," he finally said. "It does," she agreed. "I have a list started. If you can get a wagon to Cimarron day after tomorrow, I can have a proper meal on the table by supper tomorrow if there is anything at all left on this ranch to cook with." He reached past her to open the pantry door, looked at the bare shelves for a moment, then closed it again. "Walt has chickens behind the barn. There are eggs. The smokehouse has salt pork that should still be good. Root cellar off the east end of the barn has potatoes, carrots, and some dried beans from summer." "That is enough," she said. "You sure?" "Mr. Turner, I have made supper for 12 men out of less than that." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but the possibility of one, a slight easing around the corners of his eyes there for just a second and then carefully removed. "Supper is at 6, he said. "I know," she said. "Walt told me." He nodded again and left through the back door, and that was their introduction. That first supper Caroline made salt pork and potato hash with fried eggs, a pot of pinto beans she had set to soak, and then cooked hard and fast with salt, and dried chili peppers she had found in a tin at the very back of the pantry shelf, and a pan of cornbread she had managed from the last of the cornmeal. It was straightforward, frontier food, nothing elegant, but it was hot and it was real, and when the 12 ranch hands sat down at the long table and the food came out, she watched the room change. There was a sound that ran through the men, not quite words, more like a collective exhale, like men who had been holding their breath for a long time and had finally been given permission to breathe. Cornelius sat at the head of the table. He served himself from the same dishes as the rest, the same portions, no special treatment, and she respected that about him without yet knowing she did. He ate without speaking much. When he finished, he set down his fork, looked at his empty plate for a moment, and then looked up and met her eyes across the room where she was standing near the stove. "Thank you," he said. It was only 2 words. But he said them like he meant them in a way that went deeper than politeness, and Caroline nodded and turned back to the stove and told herself it did not matter. By the end of the first week, she had learned the rhythms of the ranch. The hands were up before dawn. Cornelius was always up before the hands. He was out in the barn or walking the near pastures before the sky was fully light, and by the time she had breakfast ready at first light, he came in from outside with the smell of early morning cold on him and drank his first coffee standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the pasture. She had started making his coffee before the others because she noticed he came in earlier than everyone else. She did not say anything about it. She simply had a cup ready. He took it without comment, but he also, on the third morning, set a small bunch of dried sage on the preparation counter without explanation. She put it in a jar on the windowsill and neither of them spoke of it. These small exchanges were how it began, not with words, with attention. She noticed that he did not eat well when he was eating alone, which happened sometimes when he stayed late doing accounts, and the hands had already gone to their bunkhouse. On those evenings she had started leaving a covered plate at his end of the table, something simple, something warm, and when she came in the next morning the plate was always clean and rinsed and sitting on the counter by the sink. He noticed that she swept the porch every morning after breakfast, not because anyone asked her to, but because she liked the methodical movement of it, the way it gave shape to the start of a day. One morning she came out to find he had replaced the worn broom with a new one, left leaning against the porch post with no note and no ceremony. The hands noticed things too. Walt Briggs, who had worked for Cornelius Turner for 11 years and knew his boss better than most, watched all of this with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching two lost animals find their way toward the same watering hole. Pete Alvarado, who was 22 and prone to romantic observations, made a comment at the bunkhouse one evening that earned him a sharp look from Walt and a general murmur of agreement from the rest. By the end of the second week, Caroline had the kitchen fully stocked and running on a proper schedule. She had also begun expanding her presence into the house itself, not from presumptuousness but from necessity. The main house had 3 rooms beyond the kitchen: the dining room, the front sitting room, and Cornelius's private study at the far end. The dining room and sitting room had been allowed to go dusty and stale. She cleaned them methodically over the course of several days, beating the rugs on the porch railing, wiping down the furniture, opening the windows to let the dry mountain air through. On the afternoon she tackled the sitting room. She found a photograph on the mantelpiece. It was a formal portrait, the kind taken in a studio, mounted on thick card stock. A woman, perhaps 30, with dark eyes and a composed expression. On the back of the mount in faded ink, a single name, Eleanor. Beside the photograph was a small carved horse, very fine work, the kind of thing a man keeps because he cannot bring himself to put it away. Caroline set both items back exactly where she had found them and dusted around them and did not ask, but she understood something then. She understood the empty pantry that had sat that way for 14 months. She understood the stale rooms and the worn broom and the single sprouting onion. She understood the way Cornelius Turner ate his supper looking at his plate instead of the room, and the way he sat in the kitchen, sometimes after the hands had gone, with a cup of cold coffee going untouched in front of him, looking at nothing at all. He had not been living in this house. He had been enduring it. That understanding changed the way Caroline moved through her work. Not with pity, she did not think it was pity, more like purpose. She was a practical woman and she had identified a practical problem, which was that a man who had stopped wanting to come home needed to be reminded that a home was a place worth coming back to. She did not think of it in romantic terms. She thought of it the way she thought about the kitchen. Here is what is broken, here is what it needs, here is how you fix it. On the 15th day of October she made pot roast. It was a Sunday and the hands took Sundays lighter, doing only the essential work and having the afternoon largely to themselves. Cornelius worked through Sundays the same as any other day, which she had already identified as something she disagreed with, but that was not her business to say. She had found a good cut of chuck in the cold storage, buried under other things as though it had been forgotten, and she had put it in the oven at mid-morning with onions and carrots, and a cup of the red wine that Walt kept a bottle of in the pantry for special occasions. She used the wine without asking, because she intended to replace it. By 4 in the afternoon the smell had reached the barn. She was rolling biscuit dough when Cornelius came through the back door. He stopped just inside and stood very still for a moment, and she watched something cross his face that was gone before she could fully read it. He took his hat off and set it on the hook by the door. "That is pot roast," he said. "It is," she said. He sat down at the kitchen table, which he had never done before. He always went to the dining room or to his study. He sat down at the kitchen table while she worked, and he did not say anything, and she did not say anything, and the sound of the range and the smell of the roast filled the space between them in a way that was, she thought, the most peaceful she had felt since arriving. After a while he said, "My mother used to make pot roast on Sundays." She glanced up from the biscuit dough. He was looking at the window. "Where was home?" she asked. "Kansas," he said. "Abilene, before the cattle drives changed everything." "Before I came west." "Why did you come west?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because the land out here is big enough that your problems stay small." She thought about that. "Does it work?" He looked at her. It was the first time in 2 weeks that he had looked at her the way she suspected he actually saw her, not just the cook, not just the woman in his kitchen, but a person with a question and an interest in the answer. "No," he said honestly, "not really." She smiled, just a small one, and turned back to her dough. He watched her for another moment, then stood and went to the window and looked out at the pasture, and when she called supper an hour later, he was the first one to the table. The hands ate 3 plates each, and Pete Alvarado said it was the finest Sunday supper he had eaten in his life. And old Walt Briggs said nothing, but took a 4th biscuit, and that said more than Pete's words did. Cornelius ate slowly, the way a man eats when he wants the meal to last, and when the table had cleared he lingered with his coffee while Caroline washed the dishes, and they talked. Not about anything significant, about the ranch, about the cattle moving to winter pasture next week, about whether the autumn had come in harder than last year, about small, ordinary things. But it was the first real conversation they had had, the first one that breathed naturally without either of them managing it. And when he finally said good night and went to his study, Caroline stood at the sink with her hands in the soapy water and felt a particular kind of warmth that she had not felt in a very long time. She also told herself very firmly not to be foolish about it. The warning she gave herself was practical, and it was necessary because she knew the kind of trap that sentiment could be. She had come here to do a job. She was a widow who had rebuilt her life once already from loss, and she was not in the business of handing her heart to another complicated situation. Cornelius Turner was her employer. He was kind. He was decent. He was also clearly a man who carried some history that had left its mark on him, and history like that was not something you walked into casually. She went to her room and wrote a letter to her sister in Santa Fe and said that the ranch was good, the work was satisfying, and the New Mexico mountains were very beautiful in October. She said nothing about pot roast or Sunday afternoons, or the way her employer looked at the window when he thought no one was watching. The trouble with Harland Greer began in the 3rd week. Harland Greer owned a cattle operation of his own 8 miles to the south, a larger spread than Turner Ranch, but, by general reputation, run with fewer principles. He was 42 years old, twice married, once widowed and once divorced, which in 1882 New Mexico territory was not itself scandalous, but which, combined with his general manner, told you something. He came to Turner Ranch on a Wednesday afternoon with 2 of his men, riding in uninvited the way men of his type considered their privilege. Caroline was hanging washing on the line behind the kitchen when Greer rode in. She registered him with the same assessment she gave everything, a heavy-set man on a good horse, expensive saddle, the kind of confidence that is less about competence than about money. He looked at her across the yard in a way she did not like. Cornelius met Greer on the porch. She could hear their voices but not the words. The conversation was not long. When Greer and his men rode out again, Cornelius stood on the porch for a moment looking after them. And there was something in his posture that she associated with men who have just been told something they are going to have trouble ignoring. That evening after supper, she asked Walt Briggs what the history was between Turner and Greer. Walt was a man of few words, but he was not unkind, and he respected Caroline, which she had earned by feeding him well and not asking foolish questions. He thought for a moment, then said that Greer had been after Turner Ranch for 3 years. There had been a water rights dispute, settled in Turner's favor, and Greer had not forgotten it. More recently, there had been some pressure from Greer about a shared grazing section to the north, pressure that had not yet turned into anything but pressure, but the kind that had a direction to it. And the woman in the photograph, Caroline said carefully. Eleanor. Walt's expression shifted, became more careful. Eleanor Turner, he said. Passed 2 years ago. Fever took her quick. Caroline nodded. Greer's interest in the ranch is purely business. Walt studied her with his pale, weathered eyes. Greer doesn't have a cook, he said, which was not an answer to the question she had asked, but was absolutely an answer to the question she had meant. She understood then that Greer had come to see who was living in Cornelius Turner's kitchen, and that whatever he had observed had given him ideas she wanted nothing to do with. The following week she heard from Pete, who had been to Cimarron for supplies, that Greer was telling people in town that the Turner cook was a widow woman who was looking for a better situation and would not be staying long. It was the kind of gossip that was not accidental. It was a message. It was Greer trying to establish a narrative before she had a chance to establish her own. She did not confront it directly. She was not that kind of woman. Instead, she went to the Cimarron General Store herself the following Saturday, introduced herself properly to the storekeeper and his wife, established accounts, chatted with the wives of 2 neighboring ranchers she had not yet met, and made it quietly and absolutely clear through the simple act of existing competently in the community that she was neither looking for rescue nor planning on leaving. On the ride back to the ranch, sitting up on the buckboard beside Walt Briggs, she felt the dry mountain air on her face and the wide New Mexico sky above her, and thought about what it meant to put down roots in a place. She had done it in Denver after James died, and it had taken her 2 years, and in the end it had not been enough. She did not want to think too hard about what it meant that 3 weeks in Cimarron territory already felt more like staying. The confrontation with Harland Greer happened on the 21st of October. She had gone to collect eggs from behind the barn and came around the corner of the smokehouse to find Greer standing in the side yard, alone, having apparently come onto the property without announcing himself at the main gate. This was a thing that happened in the West. Men rode where they needed to ride, but something about the deliberateness of his position, clearly having watched her come out of the kitchen and followed her path, made the hair stand on the back of her neck. He was pleasant enough in his manner, which made it worse. He asked after her situation, whether she found the work satisfying, whether she found Cimarron to her liking. She answered briefly and remained at a distance. Then he said, in a casual tone that was not casual at all, that he had a ranch house that needed a proper woman in it, and that he paid well. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said that she was not looking for new employment, thanked him for the interest, and walked back into the kitchen. Her hands shook slightly while she put the eggs in the basket on the counter, not from fear, from anger, the slow, cold kind. She said nothing to Cornelius about it that day. But when Greer came to the ranch 2 days later and she heard him on the porch telling Cornelius that his cook was planning to move on by the end of the month, something in her went very still. She stood in the kitchen and listened to Cornelius respond, listened to the lack of protest in his voice, listened to the pause where a man who believed she was staying would have said simply that was not true, and the pause told her everything. She went into the dining room and she set supper on the table, and she got through that meal with her face composed and her hands steady. And then after the hands had gone, she confronted him. And the plate hit the wall. And Caroline walked out the front door into the October afternoon and stood on the porch with her arms crossed against her chest, and the mountains going gold and amber in the late light. And she breathed, and she let herself feel the full size of what she was actually angry about, which was not just Greer's maneuvering and not just Cornelius failing to correct him, but the deeper thing beneath it, the thing she had been refusing to name for 3 weeks. She was angry because she had started to want to stay. She was angry because the kitchen had begun to feel like hers. She was angry because every morning when she heard his boots on the back porch before first light, she felt something ease open in her chest that had been closed for 2 years. She was angry because she had told herself to be practical and sensible and not foolish, and it had not worked. And now she was standing on the porch of a man who could not bring himself to want her to stay out loud, and she was 28 years old and a widow, and she was tired of practical. The front door opened behind her. She did not turn around. Cornelius Turner stepped out onto the porch and stood a few feet behind her, and she could feel him looking at her the way you can feel when someone is actually looking at you and not just in your direction. "I did not tell him you were leaving," he said. "I told him I did not know if you were planning to stay past the season." She turned then. "Why did you not know?" The question sat between them, direct and undodgeable. "Because I never asked," he said. "Because I was afraid of the answer." She stared at him. The mountains were going bronze behind him, and a cold wind was coming down off the Cimarron Range, and she felt it in her lungs when she breathed. "Afraid of which answer?" she asked. "That I was leaving or that I was staying?" He was quiet for a very long moment. A flock of starlings moved across the evening sky in a dark shifting mass, west toward the hills, and they both watched it without meaning to, and then they looked back at each other. "Both," he said. "In different ways, both." She waited. "If you were leaving," he said slowly, as though he was finding the words as he went, "then I had built something these 3 weeks that was going to be taken away. If you were staying, then I had to think about what it meant, what I was allowing to happen, what it meant that I wanted you here." "A leaner," she said, not cruelly, just naming the shape of it. He nodded once tight. "I am not trying to replace her," Caroline said carefully, "and I am not asking you to forget her. I would not ask that of anyone." "I know," he said, "but Cornelius." She used his name and it changed the register of the whole conversation. "I am not a temporary thing. I am not a hired woman who passes through and leaves and means nothing. If I stay here, it is because I choose to stay, and I need to know that choice means something to you. I need to know you are not going to hand my future to Harland Greer to manage, because it is easier than thinking about it yourself." The wind moved between them. Somewhere in the barn, a horse shifted and a board creaked. "It means something to me," he said. The words came out roughly, like they had been waiting behind a closed door for a long time. "Caroline, everything about the last 3 weeks has meant something to me. Every morning, every supper, every time I sat at a table that felt like I was supposed to be sitting there." He stopped, looked at his hands, then back at her. "I forgot how to eat alone in about 4 days. That is the honest truth. You walked into that kitchen, and inside a week I could not imagine that kitchen without you in it, and that scared me half out of my mind." She looked at him for a long moment. The anger in her chest was still there, but it had changed shape. It was not gone, it had simply become something else, something warmer and more complicated, the way fire changes from destroying to warming when it finds the right size of hearth. "Harland Greer came to me 2 days ago behind the smokehouse," she said. "He offered me a position at his ranch." Cornelius went very still. "I declined," she said, quickly and completely. "But I want you to understand that his interest in this situation is not purely about you. He wants me off your property because he believes that if your kitchen goes cold again, you will be easier to pressure about the grazing rights." Cornelius stared at her. "He came onto my land and approached you directly." "He did." The muscle in his jaw flexed hard. "I am going to Greer's ranch tomorrow." "You are going to Greer's ranch tomorrow," she agreed, and you are going to settle the grazing rights dispute cleanly and finally so that it cannot be used as a lever against anything else. And then you are going to come home." She paused. "If you want me here when you do." "I want you here," he said. There was no hesitation this time. The words came out clear and direct, the way a man speaks when he has finally stopped editing himself. "More than I know how to properly say. I want you here, Caroline." The evening air was very quiet. The mountains had gone from bronze to deep purple, and the first stars were appearing above the eastern ridge, and Caroline Wells stood on the porch of Turner Ranch and felt the ground under her feet become something it had not been in a very long time. Solid. "Then I will be here when you get back," she said. He looked at her, and in the fading light his face was open in a way she had not seen before, something taken down from it, some careful distance he had been maintaining since the first day. And without that distance he looked, she thought, exactly like a man who had just understood that the thing he was most afraid of was the same as the thing he most wanted. He reached out and briefly, carefully, touched her hand where it rested on the porch railing, just for a moment. Then he went inside. Caroline stayed on the porch until the stars were fully out, and then she went inside too, and she washed the remaining dishes, and she covered the leftover food, and she swept the kitchen floor, and she did all of these ordinary, necessary things with a warmth in her chest that she decided, this time, she was not going to argue with. Cornelius rode out the next morning before dawn. Walt Briggs went with him, and two of the hands. Caroline fed them all a solid breakfast before they left, biscuits and sausage and strong coffee, and when Cornelius came through the kitchen to collect his gear he paused at the door and said, "There are some accounts on my desk that need organizing. If you have time after the midday meal I would appreciate it." It was an ordinary request, a household management request. But it was also, she understood, an invitation into his study, which was the one room in the house she had not entered, and she understood the weight of that. "I will see to it," she said. He nodded and went out, and she watched him mount his horse from the kitchen window, watched him check his saddlebag and adjust his hat and say something to Walt, and the early morning light was thin and gray over the eastern mountains, and she felt the particular anxiety of watching someone ride toward a confrontation she could not manage for them. She kept busy. She made bread, 2 loaves, which required attention and kneading and timing. She did the midday meal, a big pot of soup from the leftover roast bones, and whatever vegetables she had on hand, enough for the hands who had stayed to eat well. She cleaned the dining room, and in the mid-afternoon she went to Cornelius's study. She had been prepared for it to feel like an intrusion, but it did not. It was a functional room, a large desk, a bookshelf, a map of the territory pinned to the wall above a filing cabinet. The accounts were indeed in some disorder, months of receipts and ledgers not properly reconciled, the kind of disorganization that happens when a man has been managing a grief and a ranch simultaneously. She sat down at the desk and began working through them systematically, the way she approached every problem. On the corner of the desk there was a letter, unfolded, that had clearly been read and set down. She did not read it. But she saw the letterhead. It was from a law office in Santa Fe, and she saw enough of the first line to understand it concerned a claim on the water rights, Greer's name in the text. She left it exactly where it was. On the bookshelf behind the desk there was a small collection of volumes, some practical, a surveying manual, a livestock handbook, a legal digest. And among them, tucked sideways on top of the others, a small book of poetry. She took it down. It was Tennyson, worn soft from handling, and inside the front cover in a woman's handwriting to Cornelius, who pretends not to like poetry. "With love, Eleanor." She held it for a moment. Then she set it back carefully, exactly as she had found it, exactly as she had set the photograph back on the mantelpiece, and she returned to the accounts, and she worked through them until the light from the west window went gold and then orange, and she could hear the horses coming back across the near pasture. She was back in the kitchen with supper on when Cornelius came through the door. Walt was with him and 2 hands. They were dusty and tired, and something in the set of Cornelius's face told her it had gone the way he needed it to. Greer signed the grazing rights agreement, Walt said, because Cornelius had not spoken yet. In writing, proper and legal with the county clerk's seal. Good, Caroline said. She put food on the table. Later, after supper, after the hands had gone, after Walt had walked out to the bunkhouse with a second cup of coffee and a meaningful lack of conversation, Cornelius sat at the kitchen table again, the way he had sat there on the Sunday of the pot roast, and Caroline poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from him. He was unpleasant, Cornelius said. I imagine he was. He said you had given him encouragement. Cornelius watched her face. He was lying, she said evenly. I know, no hesitation, clean and direct. Did he give you trouble about the agreement? He tried. Walt had the water rights judgment with him, and I had the legal letter about the grazing section, and Greer's own man Hendricks, who has been working for him 8 years, told him straight out that it was time to settle it. He paused. Apparently Hendricks has been waiting for an excuse to do that for a while. Greer signed. Then it is done. Yes, he looked into his coffee cup. Then he said quietly, I went into his house, his kitchen. She waited. It was cold, he said. Not just because nobody was cooking. It was cold the way a place is cold when nobody is living in it. He looked up. I sat at my table tonight and I thought about that. I thought about what my own house felt like 14 months ago after a leaner, and I thought about what it feels like now. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the coffee and the last of the bread she had baked that morning. The range put out a steady, comfortable heat. Through the window above the sink the last of the day's light was gone and the night was deep and full of stars. You organized the accounts, he said. They are reconciled through November. I left the December receipts for you to review. He nodded. Then after a pause, thank you. It is part of the job, she said. No, he said, it is not. He said it gently, not correcting her exactly, more completing the thought she had left open. The accounts are not part of the job. Sitting in my kitchen when I come home is not part of the job. The sage on the windowsill is not part of the job. He looked at her with those quiet, dark eyes. You have been taking care of this house in a way that goes beyond what anyone hired you to do, and I want to acknowledge that. She felt something warm and careful move through her chest. And I want to ask you, he continued, not as an employer but as a man. I want to ask you, Caroline, if you would be willing to let this be something more than a work arrangement. I know it is soon. I know I have not handled the last 3 weeks as well as I should have. I am not, I will tell you honestly, a man who has practiced at this. I have been out of practice for 2 years and I was not very experienced to begin with. She almost smiled at that. You were not very practiced at it. The corner of his mouth lifted. No, I was not. Eleanor loved you enough to write in your book of poetry, she said. Something moved across his face, tender and private and not entirely sad. She did. She was very good at saying things. I was always better at showing them. He looked at Caroline steadily. I would like the chance to show them. She looked back at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight of Turner Ranch, in the foothills of the Cimarron Range on the 24th of October, 1882, and she thought about James, who had gone into the mountains and not come back, and about the 2 years in Denver, and about the train south, and about the first morning she had stood in this kitchen and seen the single sprouting onion on the shelf and understood that this place had been waiting for something. I would like that too, she said. What followed was not a sudden declaration or a dramatic gesture. It was a series of days. And the days had a quality to them that was different from what had come before, not because everything changed, but because nothing was hidden anymore. The awareness between them that had been present since the first week was now acknowledged, present in the room, alongside them rather than concealed behind practicality and careful distance. He started eating breakfast in the kitchen instead of taking his coffee to the porch alone. Not every morning. He was still an early riser who needed the quiet of first light by himself, but sometimes, and sometimes was more than nothing. He started telling her things about the ranch in the evenings, not giving reports but having conversations, asking her opinion about whether to take on a new hand before winter, about whether the dry goods order from Cimarron should include the more expensive grade of coffee, or whether the cheaper was adequate. Small consultations that were, she understood, his way of including her. She started learning what she had not known yet, which was the full character of the ranch. She asked Walt to take her out to the cattle one afternoon, and he did, and she saw the herd in the north pasture, 800 and some Herefords moving across the dry grass in the late October sun, and Cornelius rode out from the south to meet them on the range, and the three of them stood together, and looked at the cattle and the mountains and the blue sky. And she thought she understood for the first time why a man would come west and sink his whole life into a piece of hard ground. In November, the weather changed. The Cimarron Range got its first snow on the 15th, nothing dramatic, 3 inches that melted by midday, but it announced the season and the ranch shifted into its winter rhythm. The hands were in earlier, the days were shorter, the evenings in the main house were longer. There was a fireplace in the sitting room that had not been used in months, and on the first cold evening Caroline laid a fire in it and lit it, and Cornelius came through to find it going and stood in the doorway of the sitting room looking at the light for a moment before coming in and sitting down. He had brought the Tennyson. She noticed it, but did not say anything. He set it on the arm of his chair, and after a while he picked it up and read silently for a time, and she sat across from him working on the mending she had taken on for the hands' winter clothes, and the fire crackled and the wind came off the mountains outside, and it was, she thought, the most quietly domestic and completely right moment she had experienced since she could clearly remember. "Read something," she said without looking up from the mending. A small pause. Then he read. His voice was low and even, not performative, just reading, and the words filled the warm room, and Caroline listened with her eyes on the mending and felt something knit together inside her that had been in pieces for a long time. After a while she said, "She was right. You pretend not to like poetry." He looked up. His expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, something soft and almost young in it, and then it settled into something warmer, and he said, "I never said I did not like it. I only said I did not read it often. That is the same thing." "It is not." She smiled at her mending. He went back to the book. The fire settled. Outside, the New Mexico night was deep and cold and full of stars. The formal beginning of their courtship was marked by a Sunday in late November when Cornelius asked her to accompany him on a ride up along the East Ridge to check the upper fence line. He did not call it a courtship. He said he wanted to show her the view from the ridge and that the fence needed checking. Both things were true. But she put on her good wool coat and her riding gloves that she had not had occasion to use since arriving, and he saddled a horse for her, and they rode up through the pinon and juniper on a cold, bright Sunday morning. And when they reached the ridge, the view was, as he had promised, extraordinary. The whole of the Cimarron Valley spread below them, the ranch buildings small and brown against the tan grass, the river a silver thread threading south, the mountains going blue and sharp on the horizon to the north and west. She could see for perhaps 40 miles in any direction. She said, "I understand now." He looked at her. "Why you stay," she said. "Why you built something here, why you would not let Greer take any piece of it." He looked out at the view. "My father thought I was foolish to come this far. He thought it was the end of the world." "It is the beginning of one," she said. He turned and looked at her with that steady, direct gaze and said, "Yes, that is exactly what it is." They checked the fence on the way back down and found 2 sections that needed attention and discussed whether to send a crew up in the coming week before the snow came heavy. And it was the most ordinary conversation possible. And the entire ride home she was aware of him beside her on the trail. The easy way he sat a horse. The way he pointed out a hawk on a fence post without stopping the horses. The way he said her name when he wanted her to look at something. With an ease and a certainty as though her name in his mouth had always been there. In December he kissed her. It was not dramatic or sudden. They had been standing in the kitchen after a late evening, everyone else long gone to the bunkhouse. the dishes done and the range banked for the night, and she was reaching for the lamp to carry it to her room, and he caught her free hand. She turned. He was very close. He said, "Caroline," and she said, "Yes." And then he kissed her carefully, the way a man kisses when he is aware that the moment matters. It lasted only a moment. When he drew back, he looked at her in the lamplight, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a beat. And then he said, "I have been working up to that since approximately the second week of October." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh, and the surprise of it felt wonderful. Only the second week. The first week I was still telling myself it would be foolish. And the second week I was telling myself the same thing but not quite believing it. She was still holding the lamp, and he was still holding her hand, and the kitchen was warm and quiet around them, and she said, "Cornelius, I am not a foolish woman, but I am also not a patient one, and I have been being very patient." She looked at him with complete directness. "So you should know that I have been in this house for 8 weeks, and whatever this is that is happening between us, I would like it to be real, and I would like us to be honest about it. Not managed, not kept at a distance in case it becomes complicated. Real. You are asking me to stop being afraid of it. I am asking you to decide whether you want this," she said. "Because I do. I am telling you plainly, I want this. I want to stay in this house, and I want to know you better, and I want to find out what this becomes, but only if you want the same thing." He did not hesitate this time. "I want the same thing," he said, "and I am done being afraid of it." He kissed her again, not briefly this time, and she put her free hand on his chest and felt his heart beating under her palm, and thought with a kind of clear, simple gratitude that this, exactly this, was what she had come west to find. Christmas at Turner Ranch that year was the talk of Cimarron for the better part of 3 seasons afterward. Caroline had asked Cornelius in early December whether the ranch had ever done a proper Christmas, and his answer had been a complicated expression, followed by the information that Eleanor had always managed Christmas beautifully, but that since her passing, it had not been observed much beyond a day off work for the hands. Caroline had thought about this for approximately 30 seconds and then had begun planning. She sent to the Cimarron General Store for supplies, extra flour and sugar and spices, dried fruits, a tin of molasses, a cured ham, candles. She wrote to her sister in Santa Fe, and her sister sent back a package with a few items she could not get in Cimarron. She asked Walt Briggs to find a pine tree of appropriate size on the ridge, which he did with the solemn efficiency of a man who understood the assignment, and the whole crew of hands spent an evening in the sitting room with pine branches and candles, and bits of ribbon from Caroline's sewing basket, making the house look like Christmas. She baked for 2 days straight, pies and bread and ginger cookies, and a fruitcake she had been soaking in brandy since the 1st of December. She made ham and sweet potatoes and corn pudding, and a molasses cake with a sugar glaze, and on Christmas Day she fed 18 people, because she had invited Walt's wife Mary from their small house on the east property line, and 2 of the hands had family in from Cimarron, and old Pete's mother had come the 20 miles from Rayado because Pete had written her that Christmas at the Turner Ranch was not to be missed this year. Cornelius sat at the head of that table on Christmas Day and looked down the length of it at the faces of the people eating and talking and laughing, and at the woman who had put all of it together, and something happened in his expression that Caroline caught from the kitchen doorway. She caught it and filed it away, and it was enough that she had to turn back to the kitchen and spend a moment with her hands on the counter looking out the window at the snow on the mountains before she could breathe normally again. After the Christmas dinner, and after the guests had begun making their way home, after the hands had gone singing off to the bunkhouse with a bottle of whiskey that Walt produced from somewhere, after all of that, Cornelius found her in the kitchen washing the last of the dishes in the last of the evening. He came in and picked up a dish towel and began drying without being asked, standing beside her at the sink, and she handed him plates and bowls, and he dried them and set them on the shelf, and they did not speak for a while, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of pine and cinnamon and wood smoke. Then he said, "Caroline, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I have thought about it carefully and that I am not asking it quickly or without understanding what I am asking." She kept her hands in the wash water. "All right. I want to ask you to marry me." She was quiet for a moment, not because she did not know the answer, but because the answer was large and she wanted to hold it for a second before she said it. "It is Christmas," she said finally. "I know. I have been trying to find the right moment for 3 weeks, and I kept waiting for a better one. And then I realized I was doing the thing I promised you I would stop doing, which is managing it instead of just being honest." She turned to look at him. His face was open and steady, and a little bit nervous in a way that was entirely endearing on a man who was otherwise so composed. "The honest answer," she said, "is yes, without reservation, yes." He let out a breath that contained, she thought, about 6 weeks of held tension, and then he smiled, a real smile, full and unguarded, and it changed his face completely, made him look younger and lighter, and she thought she could look at that smile for the rest of her life and not get tired of it. He kissed her there beside the sink with the dish towel still in his hand and the dishwater cooling around her fingers, and it tasted like Christmas and wood smoke, and the end of a long time being lonely. They married on the 14th of February, 1883, at the Cimarron Methodist Church, which was a small whitewashed building with a narrow steeple and a wooden floor that creaked musically when you walked on it. The minister was a young man named Reverend Albright, who had been posted to the territory the previous year, and who was earnest and sincere in a way that Caroline found genuinely moving. Walt Briggs stood with Cornelius. Caroline's sister Maria had come up from Santa Fe for the occasion and stood with her, and Maria cried from the beginning of the ceremony, which made the hands in the back pews, all 12 of them in their best clothes, shift and clear their throats in the manner of men trying not to be visibly affected by an emotion they have decided is not theirs to have. Pete Alvarado was visibly affected. He made no attempt to hide it. Old Walt, who had predicted this outcome with the confidence of a man who knows the land and the animals on it, simply looked satisfied in the way of someone whose long assessment has been confirmed. Caroline wore her best dress, a deep blue wool she had made in Cimarron by the seamstress there, and she carried a small bunch of juniper and dried wildflowers tied with a ribbon from her sewing basket because it was February in New Mexico, and the mountains were cold, and she had used what the season offered. Cornelius wore his good black suit, which fit him well, and he had his hair cut properly and his boots polished, and when he turned to see her walk down the aisle of that small creaking church, he looked at her with an expression of such complete and settled certainty that she felt it all the way through her. The vows were the traditional ones. Caroline meant every word. After the ceremony, there was a reception at the ranch, and the hands had decorated the dining room and sitting room with every remaining bit of Christmas greenery and some new-cut juniper boughs, and Caroline's wedding supper was, by a completely unbiased assessment of everyone who ate it, the finest meal that had ever been served in the Cimarron Valley. Harland Greer did not attend. He had not been invited. He had been observed, by multiple sources in Cimarron over the intervening weeks, in a state of considerable bad temper about the outcome of the grazing rights settlement and about the general direction of events at Turner Ranch. There was one incident in January when he rode onto Turner property claiming a lost steer and was met by Walt and 3 hands, who assisted him in determining that his animal was not on Turner land and that he was welcome to check his own north pasture. The incident had not escalated, but it had made clear that Greer was not going to be graceful about any of this. Cornelius had been to see the county sheriff in Cimarron in January about Greer's pattern of boundary encroachments, and the sheriff, a practical man named Hector Sandoval, who had been managing the competing interests of Cimarron Valley ranchers for 12 years, had recorded the complaint, and had also paid a visit to Greer's ranch with a very clear communication about the legal status of the settled agreements. After that visit, Greer had been quieter. Not gone, not resolved, but quieter, and that was what was available for the moment. The spring that followed their marriage was the kind of spring that the New Mexico mountains produce occasionally, as though making up for all the difficult seasons at once. The grass came in green and full, the Cimarron River ran high and clear with snowmelt, the Herefords threw strong calves, and Turner Ranch had its best calf crop in 3 years. Caroline was part of it in ways she had not been before, or rather, in ways she was now explicitly included rather than simply present. She attended the morning meetings that Cornelius had with his foreman when the day's work was being organized. She rode out to the cattle with him on Sundays when the weather allowed. She managed the household accounts alongside the ranch accounts, and her careful attention to the dry goods and household supply costs over the winter had saved a meaningful amount of money that Cornelius put toward the repair of the barn's west wall, which had been needing it for 2 years. She also kept cooking, because she was the cook and she was proud of it and had no intention of stopping, though Mrs. Walt Briggs, who was a good-natured woman named Mary who came in several days a week now to help with the heavier cleaning, sometimes teased her about it, saying that a rancher's wife was not supposed to be getting up before dawn to make biscuits. Caroline's response to this was to hand Mary a biscuit and note that getting up before dawn was the only way to ensure the biscuits were ready for the hands, who did not feed themselves, and that in her experience a household ran on 2 things, which were a good account book and a good breakfast. Mary Briggs told Walt that evening that the new Mrs. Turner was the most sensible woman she had ever met, and Walt said he had known that since approximately the 3rd day of October, and he did not know what had taken everyone else so long to figure it out. By June of 1883, Caroline knew she was pregnant. She told Cornelius on a quiet evening when the day's work was done and the hands had eaten and the house was their own. She told him plainly, the way she told him most things, sitting across from him at the kitchen table where they had had so many of their most important conversations, and she watched his face carefully as the information reached him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hands with both of his, and the look on his face was not complicated or managed or held at any kind of distance. It was full and unguarded and enormous, and she felt her eyes sting in a way that surprised her, and she blinked it back and he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "You are sure, Cornelius. I spent 2 years feeding myself on Denver wages and riding trains to New Mexico. I'm the most capable person on this property, I am sure." He smiled at that and then laughed, a real laugh, and then he got up from the table and came around and crouched beside her chair and took her hands in his and said in a voice that was quieter and more careful, "I am going to be very glad about this. I want you to know that. And I am going to be extremely watchful and probably irritating about your well-being for the next several months. You already are watchful," she said. "I am going to be more so. I know." She squeezed his hands. "I know." The baby was born on the 15th of February, 1884, one day after their first anniversary, which was a fact that Caroline pointed out with some amusement through the more challenging portions of the labor, and which the midwife, a capable and unsentimental woman named Mrs. Archuleta, who had attended more births in Cimarron County than she could accurately count, found extremely funny. It was a boy. Cornelius James Turner, named for his father, and for the man Caroline had loved and lost in the Denver mountains, because she had found that love does not cancel love, it expands to include it. Cornelius held his son for the first time with the same expression he had worn at Christmas, that full, unguarded astonishment that was his particular version of joy, and Mary Briggs wept openly in the hallway, and Walt pretended to be extremely interested in the condition of the porch railing. Pete Alvarado, hearing the news, went behind the barn and may or may not have had a moment of private emotion. He told no one. But the next morning he was at the kitchen door with a carved wooden horse, carefully made, clearly having been worked on for some weeks, and he set it on the kitchen counter and said it was for the baby, and Caroline thanked him with real warmth, and the horse went on the sitting room shelf beside Eleanor's carved horse, and both of them stayed there together, which felt entirely right. The summer of 1884 was busy and full and somewhat sleepless, which was not unique to their situation, but which Cornelius navigated with a dedication that Caroline found deeply touching. He was not a man who had been raised to think of infant care as his domain, but he was a man who believed that what was in his house was his responsibility, and he applied this belief to his son with the same thoroughness he applied to the cattle and the fence lines. He got up in the night without being asked. He learned the particular carrying method that settled young Cornelius James when nothing else would. He sat in the rocking chair in the sitting room at 3 in the morning, reading Tennyson aloud to a baby who stared at the ceiling with the profound blankness of the very young, and Caroline, passing the doorway on her way to the kitchen for water, stopped and watched them and felt something so complete and warm in her chest that she had to lean against the wall for a moment. Harland Greer attempted one more encroachment in September of 1884, sending 2 of his men to cut a section of Turner fence on the northern boundary, under the claim of accessing water rights that had been settled against him more than a year previous. This time Cornelius rode to Cimarron himself and filed a formal complaint with Sheriff Sandoval, who had the men cited, the fence repaired at Greer's expense, and a formal written warning issued to Greer's operation. The attorney in Santa Fe who had been handling the water rights case wrote to confirm that the settled judgment was fully protective and enforceable. After that, Greer stopped. Not out of conscience, Caroline suspected, but out of calculation. He had lost the legal ground and he knew it, and continuing to press against a man who now had a wife and a son, and a full bunkhouse of loyal hands and an excellent relationship with the county sheriff, was simply bad investment. He redirected his attentions elsewhere, eventually selling a portion of his South Range to a new operation from Colorado, and gradually became less of a presence in the valley's daily concerns. The absence of that pressure was something Caroline only fully appreciated once it was gone. She had been managing it quietly, the way she managed most things, carrying the awareness of it alongside everything else, and when it lifted, she found the air had a different quality, a lightness that she felt in her shoulders and her sleep. The fall of 1884 brought the second anniversary of Caroline's arrival at Turner Ranch. She noted it privately, not certain whether Cornelius would remember the date, and was quietly undone when she came down to the kitchen on the first morning of October to find a small bunch of dried sage on the preparation counter. The same as the first time, 2 years ago. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. Then she heard him come through the back door and stamp the morning frost from his boots, and she turned, and he was looking at her with that quiet expression that she now knew as well as any landscape she had ever lived in, the particular face of a man who has learned to be fully present in his own life. 2 years, he said. 2 years, she agreed. He came to her and kissed her in the morning kitchen the way he kissed her every morning, with simple certainty. And from the room beyond the kitchen, the baby made a sound indicating that the morning had his full attention, and his parents' sentimentality was not going to delay breakfast. They had a second child in 1886, a girl they named Maria Eleanor, after Caroline's sister, and after the woman whose love had shaped this house before Caroline came to it, because some names are carried forward as honor and not as competition. Maria Eleanor was born in April, in a spring even better than 1883, and she came into the world with a ferocious set of lungs, and an expression that Walt Briggs described as having strong opinions, which turned out to be accurate in every way. Young Cornelius James, aged 2, regarded his sister with the philosophical uncertainty of a toddler who has not yet decided whether this development is positive. His assessment eventually moved toward positive, though this process required several months and the mediation of Caroline, who found that cooking was applicable to more problems than just hunger. The household expanded accordingly. Mary Briggs was now spending 4 days a week at the main house. A young woman from Cimarron named Rosa Gallegos had been hired on as help with the children, a capable and cheerful presence who became quickly indispensable. The bunkhouse had a new hand, a quiet man named Thomas from Texas who turned out to be an exceptional horseman, and who fit into the ranch community with the ease of someone who had always been looking for exactly this. The kitchen remained Caroline's. This was understood by everyone on the property, without it ever being explicitly stated. Mary helped and Rosa occasionally stirred a pot when asked, but the kitchen was Caroline's domain in the way that the pastures and the cattle were Cornelius's, which is to say it was the extension of her capability and her care, and her particular understanding of what a household needed to be. She cooked breakfast and supper every day. She planned the meals with the same attention she gave the account books. She kept the pantry stocked and the range clean and the kitchen warm, and every morning and every evening the hands came in from the cold and the dark and the work and sat down at the long table to food that was real and abundant and made with the kind of attention that says you matter. And she watched them eat and felt the full weight of what a meal means when it is given freely. Cornelius never stopped noticing. This was one of the truths she had discovered about him in the years of their marriage. He was a man who paid attention to things that mattered and never stopped. He never stopped noticing the sage on the windowsill. He never stopped reading to the children at night in the sitting room by the fire. He never stopped finding her in the kitchen at the end of a day and standing close, not in the way of need but in the way of presence, just being there, in the place where she was, because it was where he wanted to be. In 1887, the spring roundup brought the largest calf count Turner Ranch had ever recorded. 943 calves from the Hereford herd, a number that represented years of careful breeding management and good winter care, and the kind of luck that comes to people who have put in the work to deserve it. The ranch had expanded to just over 5,000 acres, having purchased a section of the old grazing land to the north from the estate of a rancher named Porter who had died without heirs, and whose land had been offered first to his neighbors, per the arrangements he had made with his attorney. Caroline attended the spring roundup supper that year with Maria Aliner on her hip and Cornelius James running at her heels, and she fed 40 people under the big sky of the north pasture, pots and Dutch ovens and a whole side of beef, roasted over a fire that Pete Alvarado had been tending since dawn. And the evening went on until the stars were very thick, and the children were asleep on blankets under the wagon, and the hands were singing, which they did every year at roundup supper. The old trail songs that most of them had learned before they had learned much else. Cornelius sat beside her on a wagon gate with his shoulder against hers and his children sleeping nearby and his cattle grazing in the dark beyond the firelight, and he said, "I keep thinking about the first time you fed us all. Salt pork hash," she said. "I thought I had not eaten a real meal in a year and a half," he said. "I think I was right. You were right. What was the first thing you thought when you saw that pantry?" She considered. That this was a house that needed someone to want to be in it. He looked at her in the firelight for a moment. Then he said, "You were right about that too." She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, just for a moment, in the comfortable, easy way of people who have been leaning on each other long enough to do it without thinking. And then someone started a new song, and Pete Alvarado's young cousin, who had come out from Cimarron for the roundup, clapped her hands and the whole camp brightened. And Caroline sat up and looked at the stars and the fire and the sleeping children and the faces of the people she had built a life among. The years continued in the way of good years, full and sometimes difficult and always real. The territory of New Mexico was changing around them, pushing toward statehood, the railways expanding, new towns and new people and new arguments about land and water and the future. Caroline followed it with interest, reading the newspapers that came from Santa Fe and Albuquerque, discussing them with Cornelius in the evenings. There were complications, as there always were. A severe drought in 1889 that cost them 40 head of cattle and required Caroline to manage the household budget with an austerity she had not needed since the first weeks. A hard winter in 1890 that kept everyone on the property for weeks at a stretch with the snow too deep for regular travel. A legal challenge to the eastern boundary of the property from a new operation that had bought up land adjacent, a challenge that the Santa Fe attorney handled competently and resolved in Turner Ranch's favor, but which was stressful while it lasted. Through all of it, the kitchen remained warm. This was not a small thing. Caroline had understood from the beginning, from the moment she had seen the bare pantry and the sprouted onion and the cold stove, that a kitchen was a kind of heart in a working house, and that what happened at the table when people sat down together was not just eating but something older and more necessary, the daily confirmation that the people around you are real and present and fed, which is to say, cared for. She had never stopped believing this, and she had never stopped acting on it. The third child came in 1891, a boy they named Henry Walt Turner, the middle name a deliberate tribute that made old Walt Briggs, upon hearing it, go back to being extremely interested in the condition of the porch railing for a period of several minutes, while Mary Briggs made no attempt whatsoever to manage her emotions. Henry was a round, cheerful baby who grew into a round, cheerful toddler with an enthusiasm for horses that was absolute from the first moment he understood what a horse was. Cornelius, who had passed his own love of horses to young Cornelius James and found it returned with interest, was delighted. The barn at Turner Ranch became, in the years that followed, a place with a great deal of small-person activity in it, which the horses tolerated with varying degrees of grace. Maria Eleanor, who was 5 when Henry arrived, and who had the strong opinions that Walt had identified at her birth, regarded her new brother with the assessment of someone who has already been through this process once and knows how it goes. She was, in fact, excellent with him, in the bossy, competent way of a child who has decided that if something is going to be done, it should be done correctly. Caroline watched her children growing up in this house, in this kitchen at this table, and felt a satisfaction that was not simple or shallow but deep and earned, the satisfaction of a woman who had made choices and built something real from them. She thought sometimes about the girl who had lost her first husband in the mountains above Denver and had spent 2 years in a city kitchen saving money and trying to find the direction of the next thing. She thought about the woman who had stepped off the train at Cimarron with a cast iron skillet wrapped in brown paper and a practical assessment of her situation. She thought about the first morning in this kitchen, the empty shelves, the sprouted onion, the cold stove. She had walked into a house that was enduring and she had made it a home, and then the man who had been enduring in it had become a man who was living in it, and then they had become people who were living in it together. And then there were children who had never known it any other way, and that was, she thought, the whole story, except that it was not finished and she did not want it to be. On the first day of October, 1892, the exact 10th anniversary of her arrival, Caroline Wells Turner came down to the kitchen at first light and found Cornelius already there, not with coffee at the window as he had stood that first week, but sitting at the kitchen table where they had shared so many of their most important conversations, with 2 cups of coffee already poured and a small bunch of dried sage in a jar in the center of the table. He looked up when she came in, and his face was the face she knew better than any other face in the world, the strong jaw and the close dark beard now more gray than dark, the eyes that were quiet and steady and fully present, the particular expression that was his version of happiness. 10 years, he said. She sat down across from him and wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup. "Do you know what I thought?" he said. "The first time I walked in here and found you with that notebook. Tell me. I thought someone is going to take care of this place. He paused. I did not know I meant myself. She smiled. You needed feeding. I needed everything, he said. I had been managing for so long I had forgotten there was a difference between managing and living. You walked in here with a cast iron skillet and a list, and you just started doing things. And somewhere inside the first week I realized I had been sitting at an empty table for a year and a half and I had stopped noticing how hungry I was. He held her gaze. Not just for food, for all of it. For the fire and the conversation and the sound of someone in the kitchen. For someone to read poetry at. For someone to fight about the right thing and make me honest. A beat. For you specifically, as it turns out. That is very specifically true, she said. I know. It took me some weeks to understand it that clearly. 3 weeks, she said. And then you gave away my departure date to Harland Greer. He winced. She laughed. 10 years had made that particular wound into something they could joke about, which was one of the reliable markers of a love that had been properly tested. I was afraid, he said. I told you that. You did, and then you stopped being afraid, and you have not started again. No, he said, I have not. She reached across the table, and he took her hand, and they sat in the kitchen in the first light of October, with the range warming and the smell of coffee, and the sounds of the ranch coming alive outside. And in the rooms beyond the kitchen, their 3 children were beginning to stir, and the hands would be in for breakfast in an hour. And the day was full, and the life was full, and Caroline Turner looked at her husband in the kitchen that had been hers, and his since she walked into it 10 years ago. And she thought about all the breakfasts and suppers and late evenings and early mornings that had made up a decade of belonging to this place and to this person. And she thought about the empty pantry and the cold stove and the woman she had been when she stood here the first time with her notebook and her practical assessment. She had come to cook for the ranch. She had not come to stay. She had not come to fall in love. She had not come for any of this. But a man had forgotten how to eat alone, and she had remembered him how. And somewhere in the feeding of him, the table had become theirs, and the house had become theirs, and the life had become theirs. And she was not practical about that anymore. She was not managing it or holding it at any kind of careful distance. She was simply grateful, all the way through, for every ordinary and extraordinary day of it. Another decade, she said. He squeezed her hand. At least. She stood up to start the breakfast. Young Henry's feet came thundering down the hall. Maria Eliner's voice, already full of morning opinion, followed. Cornelius James, 12 years old and already carrying himself with the same deliberate ease as his father, appeared in the kitchen doorway and came in without being asked and stood at the kitchen window looking at the pasture in the early light, the way his father used to do alone. Except that he was not alone. Caroline was at the stove and Cornelius was rising to go to the window with his son, and Henry was arriving in an explosion of small child energy, and Maria Eliner was negotiating something in the hallway, and the kitchen was warm and full, and the mountains outside were going gold in the October morning. And this was the day, and the next day, and all the days after, and it was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.